G'day everyone, and welcome to week 9 of LA 3006 Administrative Law. This week we're looking at information and the public right to information. In this first video, we're going to look at the question conceptually. What do we mean when we talk about a right to information? Why does it matter? Why does it matter so much that we spend a full week of an admin course looking at it? In the second video, we're going to look directly at the processes which exist for you and your clients to obtain information. So we're going to look at those parts of the ADJR Act which allow you to obtain information, and we're going to look at the Freedom of Information legislation. We're also going to look at some little known but amazingly useful items called Harradine lists and disclosure logs. A lot of students are amazed to find out that those things exist. Finally, in the third video, we're going to look at the exemptions to freedom of information, the things that you can't get your hands on. So let's start at the very start with some conceptual stuff. Governments collect massive amounts of information. Government files are absolutely bursting with the stuff. They collect the information when applications are made, when taxes are paid, when you fill out the census. Pretty much whenever anybody engages with the government in any way, it creates a paper trail, and that paper trail is preserved. Many years ago, in 1946, the United Nations formed the view in UN General Resolution 59 that information held by governments is, in principle, public information. It follows that, in principle, the public should be able to obtain that information. Now, when that doesn't happen, when the government can hide its information in secure archives, time and time again, we've seen that what we end up with is bad government and bad outcomes for the people. From the very start of this course, we've talked about the separation of powers and the Westminster system of responsible government. Now, obviously, if the executive government can keep secrets, that just makes it way harder for those outside the government to hold it accountable. And it makes it way easier for the government to get away with corrupt or just inept performance. Let's look at a couple of examples. As history will remember for a long time, in late 2019, a new, highly infectious, highly dangerous strain of coronavirus emerged in the Wuhan province of China. The Chinese government was quickly provided with information about this virus, but they kept that information secret. A prominent doctor posted warnings on social media weeks before the outbreak became public, and he was arrested. China released information only once it was clear that the virus had already been transmitted beyond China, so there was no keeping it secret now. The World Health Organization, whose own response to the virus was completely inept and ineffective, eventually sent a team to China to investigate, but they were blocked from even entering China for months, and then they were shown only what the Chinese government wanted them to see. And then their report was heavily doctored by Chinese authors. So it reads like a cheerleader's sheet for the Chinese government, not much at all like a scientific paper. The coronavirus was bad, but the secrecy, the lack of accountability, that's what turned it into a global epidemic. Closer to home, in Queensland from the 1950s until the 1980s, policing was run by a corrupt rat pack of police officers headed by a man named Terry Lewis. The rat pack was particularly keen on corrupt dealing with illegal bookies and illegal brothels. They had cosy relationships with a number of ministers, including police ministers, which led to Lewis, a terrible criminal, being appointed police commissioner. Ultimately, the investigative journalism of two journalists, Chris Masters and Phil Dickey, led to an inquiry called the Fitzgerald Inquiry, which blew apart the entire architecture of police corruption in Queensland. Tony Fitzgerald QC, who headed the inquiry, made it clear in his report that corruption of this type would only flourish in an environment of secrecy, and he promoted two measures: freedom of information and the implementation of a Queensland equivalent of the ADJR Act. They were promoted as key measures for overcoming this culture of corruption. So at the broad social level, freedom of information matters because it makes it harder for malevolent people to act corruptly. They know that not just individuals, but also journalists and members of the political opposition can use freedom of information and obtain information about what's going on inside the government. Now let's step it down to the individual level. Think about some of the grounds for review that we considered earlier in this course. Can you see that many of those grounds for review would be completely useless unless you could see inside the decision-making process? For instance, under the hearing rule of natural justice, you're entitled to be shown everything considered by the decision maker. But if you can't find out what materials they actually did consider, how would you ever know if they'd considered some document you weren't shown? How would you know if they'd taken into account an irrelevant matter, if they've failed to consider a relevant matter? How would you know if there was actual evidence of a fact or whether the no evidence rule applied? If lists of delegations were not made public, how would you know whether the decision was being made by the right person? Can you see that in the absence of access to information, the rest of administrative law ceases to be useful? To really get the best out of our processes of administrative law, to really engage with either legal review or with merits review, you need to be able to find out as much as you possibly can about the decision you're challenging and the process that led to that decision. In the second video this week, we're going to look at how you do that. We're going to look at the mechanisms which you can use to look behind the public service curtain and see how decisions were made. We'll be looking at measures arising from the ADJR Act, measures arising in individual pieces of legislation, and then we'll be looking at the Freedom of Information Act and the Privacy Act, which together provide Australians with incredible tools to examine government processes. See you in the second video.